All right, Shabbos, say good morning. Let us begin. Thank our TALMUD TORAH sponsors for the month of Adar Al. To thank Paul and Kathy Pollack for dedicating all the Shurman Drashos this month in memory of Paul's grandparents, Zechariah ben Zechariah and Dinah bas Reb Dov. To thank Art and Shari Miller, our TALMUD TORAH sponsors, for dedicating all the Shurman Drashos this month. In loving memory of Art's brother, Richard Miller, Reuven ben Betzalel Varachel. And our week of learning sponsors, Ayala and Sarah Steinberg, for the refuah shalema of Shulamis bas Susha. Let's see, we hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the neshamas will have an aliyah. Those who need a refuah should have one together with Kol Cholei Yisrael. And I will say with that, I'll also mention, we dedicate our learning to our brothers and sisters, to Achinu B'nai Yisrael, who are literally undergoing incredible difficulties in the various communities in the Ukraine. I was on a conference call yesterday with 5 rabbanim from the communities in Ukraine, and it's overwhelming to see what's happening. People hunkered down in basements for days, some able to get out, some unable to get out. Food is running low, supplies are running low. It is a very, very, very serious matzav. And again, you could see that just in the news this morning, Russia is pounding Kharkiv and Kyiv with they're saying now cluster, but crazy, absolute craziness. Dozens of civilians killed in a shell that hit an apartment building. It's a serious matzah for the world, and it's a serious matzah for Am Yisrael as well. And it's in these moments that we really have to take upon ourselves something extra as well, to rededicate ourselves to our learning. There's community Tehillim tonight at 8 o'clock p.m. at Shomrei Amunah. If you can go, we should all go. In other words, just to be part of a community, to daven together, and to take some other Kabbalah upon ourselves. It's a scary matzav. It's hard for us to wrap our heads around 2022, living in a basement, in what should be a civilized country. But this is what many tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of Jews are experiencing right now. And it behooves us, as all of us feel in Achrayus to greater Klal Yisrael. We don't just live for ourselves, but we live as part of a nation to do our part. It's important to give tzedakah. There are various causes collecting for this. The OU is collecting, Agudas Yisrael is collecting, Hatzalah is collecting. So wherever you want to contribute. Contribute. This is not for luxuries, right? This is not to send people away for a 5-star Pesach vacation. It's food. It's literally food. It's food and resettlement costs, because many of these people are going to lose their homes. They're going to lose everything that they've worked for. And if we could help out with a little bit of money, that's not going to make a dent in our finances. It's absolutely incumbent upon us. So to give tzedakah, to daven, to rededicate ourselves, maybe to take on a Kabbalah, take on something extra. And the Meretz Hashem, the schus of our learning this morning, and the schus of everything we're going to do, Kadosh Baruch Hu, Meretz Hashem, should take care of all of Klal Yisrael and every Eis Tzara. Well, so with that, let us begin. So today's daf is Chaf. We are picking up Meretz Hashem on your test Amud Beis 19b. We're picking up 2 lines up from the bottom. I will say, so really we have some fascinating sugyas ahead of us today. So the Gemara says as follows: Amar Rav Mari. Rav Mari said, Shema Mino Chulin Shenasu Al Taras HaKodesh Kekodesh Damu. So we'll say, remember again, we discussed this in passing a little bit in the Mishnah. It's actually fascinating, by the way. I just want to point out, those of you who are doing Mishnah Yomi will notice the incredible intersect between our sugyas. Because in fact, again, in today's Mishnah Yomi, I just posted it earlier this morning. In today's Mishnah Yomi, you will notice that there's the concept of becoming a chaver. Yesterday we had the concept of becoming a ne'eman. And ultimately, again, the Mishnayos discussed the concept of chulin shenasu al taras hakodesh, which is really, really amazing. So chulin shenasu al taras hakodesh is exactly as it sounds, which is a person is makbid to go ahead and eat their chulin, which means unconsecrated produce, with the same level of sanctity with which one would treat karbanos. Right? So that's chulin shenasu al taras hakodesh ki kodesh damu. So the Gemara says, you see from here, you'll see where we see it, but you see from here that the way we look at chulin, that is, we treat chulin that is prepared with sacrificial sanctity, which put it in the same category as kodesh. So the Gemara says, mimai. How do you know that? And I will say, what that means is, remember, our Mishnah on Yud Ches Amud Beis outlined a series of halachos regarding ritual purity. So what the Gemara is just saying is, when it comes to ritual purity of chulin, shena'asu al taras kodesh, we treat it like kodesh. Mimai, how do I know this? Top of chaf. Midalo katani behu maila. That was it's very interesting from the fact that ultimately, again, we don't go ahead and attribute to it attribute to it another level. Now look at Rashi. Tap Rashi Chaf Amud Aleph. Rashi says, Lomar, big day prushin ha'ochlin chulein betaras chulin medris la'ochle betaras hakodesh. Remember again, the Mishnah did not contain a category that said as follows, that the people who go ahead and eat their chulin, like chulin, betaras chulin, that their clothing is tumas medris for those who eat their chulin in a state of taras hakodesh. Right? Remember again, we spoke about this at the end of the Mishnah. So the fact that that category is not included tells us, Rashi says, Shma mina bichlal kodesh hein v'hatan le kodesh. It tells us that chulin shenasu al taras hakodesh are included in the category of kodesh. So the Gemara says, Di'i dama l'truma hatani truma, because ultimately, again, if they're compared, Vidilma, maybe the reason why it didn't make a different category of chulin shenasu al taras hakodesh. Why? Because here's what we know. Perhaps, I know it's not like chulin, but I don't know what it's like. Because maybe Di'i dama l'truma hatani truma. Maybe it's like truma, and it's included in the category of truma. Vi dama l'chulin hatani l'chulin. And maybe it's included in the chulin, and again, just included in the category of chulin. This nan, chulin shenasu al taras hakodesh. If you have chulin that was prepared with the same level of sanctity as kodesh, kodesh, of course, in this context means karbanos, harehein ki chulin. They are still treated like chulin. Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Tzadok, Omer, harehein ki truma. Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Tzadok says, no, they're like truma. We'll say, so the point that the Gemara is making is, don't assume that the absence of an additional category of chulin shenasu al taras hakodesh means that ultimately, again, these items are treated like kodesh. It could just as easily mean that they're treated like truma or they're treated like chulin. V'haraya, that machlokes exists, elami seifa. Rather, again, you could see the fact that chulin shenasu al taras hakodesh are treated like kodesh from the seifa of the Mishnah. What did the seifa say? Yosi ben Yoezer haya chasid shebekahuna. Remember also just a quote from our Mishnah on Yud Chesam Beis. Yosi ben Yoezer was one of the pious members of the kahuna. V'haisa mitpachto medris lakodesh. And yet his handkerchief was considered to possess tumas medris for those who were makbid on a kodesh level of tara. Right? So I will say, so remember again, we saw this just 2 days ago. Right? So remember again, Yosi ben Yoezer, who himself was a Kohen, not only a Kohen, a chassid of the kahuna, his handkerchief, when it came to halachos of Tumas Tara, was considered to possess Tumas Medris for those who went ahead and were makbid to maintain a level of sanctity for Kodesh. Similarly, Yochanan ben Gudgada haya ochel al taras hakodesh kol yamav. Yochanan ben Gudgada, he was makbid to always eat his chulin al taras hakodesh. Remember again, there are people like this. The Mishnah and the Mai calls a person like this a chaver, right? And what does a chaver do? A chaver is makbid that everything he eats, he essentially treats like karbanos. So we'll say, which if you think about it, is a pretty incredible thing, which means that he maintains, we'll call it sacrificial level of sanctity, even when he eats mundane food. So he's eating regular chulin on a Tuesday, right? But yet he's going to treat that chulin like karbanos, and therefore conduct himself with the requisite level of sanctity, or I should say, not even sanctity, purity, tara, necessary for the consumption of karbanos. So such a person like this, I would say, was Yochanan ben Gudgada. Yochanan ben Gudgada, haya ochel al taras hakodesh. He ate all of his food al taras hakodesh. So everything he ate again as if he was consuming karbanos. So Shabbos say again, so he was careful not to allow the food to come in contact with anything that was ritually impure. He was makbid himself to always remain in a constant state of ritual purity. And yet, v'haisa mitpachto medris lechatos. Yet his handkerchief was considered to possess tumas medris. Right? Was tumas medris. Tumas medris like a zav that supports his weight on something that gives it tumas medris. Yet his handkerchief had tumas medris lechatos. Lechatos. Never say. Remember again. What's chatos? Paraduma. Right? Paraduma is the highest level of sanctity. So we'll say, let's deconstruct this ourselves. So Yochanan ben Gudgada, who was makbid to eat even his chulin al taras hakodesh with a level of sacrificial sanctity. So the Mishnah said his handkerchief was tumas medris for those who dealt with chatas, for those who dealt with paraduma. What do you see from there? His handkerchief was considered to be tumas medris for chatas, but not for what? Not for what? Not for kodesh. What do you see from here? Lechatas in the kodesh lo alma kasavar chulin shenasu al taras hakodesh ke kodesh damu. Rabbi say, what do you see from here? From the fact that Yochanan ben Gudgada's handkerchief was only a problem of tumas medris for chatas, for para aduma, tells us that a person who is makbid to eat his chulin al taras hakodesh, such chulin has, we'll call it kodesh sanctity. So therefore his handkerchief was only a problem not for kodesh, but only a problem ultimately for the level above, which was chatos. Okay, incredible. So we'll say that's the raya from the Mishnah, that chulin shenasu al taras hakodesh, that when chulin, we'll say all it's saying is like this, chulin, which is unconsecrated produce, that you prepare and that you treat with the same level of sanctity as karbanos, has carbonic sanctity. That's all it's saying. It has carbonic sanctity for what? For the halachos of Tumah and Tara. That's all it's saying. So therefore, again, when you treat it with carbonic sanctity, you endow, quote unquote, endow it with carbonic sanctity. It's still chulin. It's not karbanos. But for the halachos of Tumah and Tara, it will have the status of karbanos. Incredible. But see, now we come to three very interesting cases. So we'll say these are the three cases that are going to serve as the basis for our conversation for pretty much the rest of the daf. So the Gemara says as follows. So I'll say I'll just point out. If you just look, I'm sorry, let me just bring you back. If you look at the last Rashi on your Tesam with Beis, I meant to read this. Let's say, you're thinking to yourself, why would a person eat their chulin like this, right? After all, again, this is a heightened level of halacha, right? A person is eating all of his chulin, b'taras hakodesh. So just look at Rashi, shnas taras hakodesh, adam harag yelechol kodshim. Now, we'll say, by the way, who would normally do this? Kohanim would do this, right? And which Kohanim? Kohanim who were accustomed to eating karbanos. So if you are a Kohen, and you regularly ate karbanos, mikabel alav le'echol chulav b'taras hakodesh, kedei shiyu b'nei beiso zehirin u'bekiyin b'taras hakodesh. I will say, normal people don't do this. The only person who would really do this would be a Kohen, right, who is eating karbanos. So if you're a Kohen who eats karbanos, it's dangerous to kind of have two systems of consumption going on in your house, right? We eat one way when we eat karbanos, and we eat another way when we eat chulin. It's just dangerous because inevitably people are going to make mistakes with karbanos. So there were Kohanim, therefore, who were makbid to eat their chulin betara. So in other words, we have one standard of consumption in the home, and essentially that standard of consumption is like sacrificial consumption. That's the standard. This way, again, everything we do in the house has that same standard, whether we're eating chulin, whether we're eating kosher. So we'll say that's why a person would do it. And therefore, halacha l'maisa, what the Mishnah, what the Gemara says is that a person who treats his chulin b'taras hakodesh essentially, at least halachically, endows his chulin with that same level of sanctity, and therefore, vis-a-vis the halachos of Tum and Tara, that chulin will be treated like kodesh. Good, that's it. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Allah, supposed to listen to these cases. Nafal maf. So I'll say, just by the way, there happens to be a good Musar Haskell in that in general, which is that sometimes it's hard to live with two sets of standards. Right, and many of us try to do this, but it doesn't really work. It's kind of like people who are honest in business with fellow Jews, but take liberties with non-Jews. I'm not a businessman. Don't do business with people like that, because once you're cutting corners with someone, you're going to cut corners with everyone. That's halaf. And I'll say even ourselves, like, to be honest, most of us live with two personalities, right? We have an external persona and a internal or personal persona. And the image we project to the world is rarely the totality of the full person we are behind closed doors. And it's hard to be kind of like spiritually schizophrenic, right? We often have like these two identities. We have these two standards. In public, where other people can see, I'll do X. In private, where other people don't see, I'll do Y. And it's hard. It's hard to lead two lives, and it's hard to prop up two identities, and it's hard to kind of live in two worlds often that are contradictory to each other. So sometimes in life, it's good to eat your chulin b'tara, right? It's good to say, you know what? I'm adopting a standard, and this is going to be my standard, my guiding light in public and behind closed doors as well. It's hard. It's really, really hard, but halavai is something that we should aspire to and something one day we should achieve. So the Gemara goes right. Amar Rabbi Yonasan ben Elazar. Nafla ma'afarto hemenu. These are great. Let's say you have to admit that when you take the time to kind of unwrap Tuman Tara, it's riveting. It's absolutely riveting, and it actually makes a lot of sense. We tense up when we get to these sugyas. We tell ourselves, "No, I'm gonna understand this," but the truth is, it's actually very attainable. So I'm Rabbi Yonasan ben Elazar. Nafla ma'afarta. Here's the case. I drop my cloak. I'm I say to my friend, "Give me my cloak." My friend gives it to me. Tmeya. My cloak is now tameh. All right, so we'll say, so first of all, take a look at Rashi, Tmeya, Vafilu Zetar. Now, we're going to see why this is. I'm not going to read Rashi because I don't want to give away. Rashi kind of is like a spoiler alert over here, right? Rashi gives away the whole sugya in one Rashi. We'll get to it. But I will say, but Bepashtos, so again, simple case. I have my cloak, falls on the floor. I ask Reuven, my friend, to pick it up and give it to me. Reuven gives it to me. My cloak is tameh. Okay, so the Gemara. So we'll say. So again. So b'pashtos. Let's make the assumption over here that the issue is that when something is in the hands of my friend, I can't control what happens to it vis-a-vis tuman tara, and if halacha l'maisa, the cloak is tameh. Case 1. Case 2. Rabbi Yonasan ben Amram. Rabbi Yonasan ben Amram says as follows. We'll say 2 Rabbi Yonasans. For Rabbi Yonasan ben Elazar, Rabbi Yonasan ben Amram. Nischafu lo kelim shal Shabbos bekelim shal chavalav shan. A very interesting case. I go in to take out my Shabbos suit, but instead I pull out my weekday suit. Right? So what happens? So on this chafalo kelim shal Shabbos bekelim shal chol. Sorry, just the opposite. I go in to take out my weekday suit, but I end up pulling out my Shabbos suit, v'lav shan, and I wear my Shabbos suit, nitmu. My Shabbos suit is tameh. Okay, look at Rashi just a moment. Kelim shal Shabbos, kelim shal chol. Kasavar lital begadav shal chol v'natal shal Shabbos. I wanted to take my weekday suit, but I ended up taking my Shabbos suit. Nitma, Rashi says, Kasavar laite hashla desirle mishamar davar bechezka shu davar zeh v'nimtza shu davar achin shim. So we're going to see when it comes to halachas of Tuman Tara, there's two incredible important principles, and they're really intertwined. Number one, Tuma can't have hesach hadas. In order to maintain the ritual purity of a particular item, you must be fully aware of that item. And any lapse of awareness of the item, by definition, results in tumah. Rabbi say, by the way, I'll tell you one of the areas where we actually practice this halacha. The Beis Halevi brings down that by afikomen, right? Why do we eat afikomen on Pesach? We eat afikomen to be zecher lekarban Pesach, right? Do you remember the Paschal Lamb? What do we do with the afikomen? You break the matzah in half. What do you do with the half? That's the afikomen. You wrap it up and you put it by you. Why do you wrap it up and put it by you? So the Beis Halevi says, because a carbon requires shimur. You're not allowed to let a carbon, once you designate an animal as a carbon, you can't let that animal out of your sight. You're obligated to watch it. The afikomen, which represents carbon Pesach, needs to be guarded, since it's a sacrificial item. The way I guard it, right, is I wrap it up and I put it by me. With tumah, the moment that there's hesach hadas, the moment that there's a lapse of awareness, is the moment that an item becomes tameh. It lacks shimur. So therefore, Abba say in this second case over here, bepashtas, what we're assuming is like this. I had in mind to take out my weekday suit. Instead, I went ahead and took out my Shabbos suit and put out my Shabbos suit. So the Shabbos suit is tameh. Because the assumption, we'll see, but right now the havamina is that you can't, the only way to have proper awareness, proper shimur, is to know exactly what it is that you're watching. But if at the end of the day you think you're watching A, but it really turns out to be B, that's hesach hadas. That's a lapse of awareness, and therefore the item becomes tameh. Third case. We're going to explain all these cases. There was one time a story of two women who were friends, who were in the bathhouse together, and they got their clothing mixed up. Right? Their clothing got mixed up. And what happens? Uba Ma'aseh Rabbi Akiva. So each one essentially ended up wearing the other one's clothing out of the bathhouse. The story came to Rabbi Akiva, and what happens? V'timan. And Rabbi Akiva said, Tameh. Tameh, the clothing is Tameh. Okay. So we'll say that's analyzed. Maskil Rabosha. Elameata. Okay, based on Rabosha. So really, what's kind of coming out of all of these stories, there's a common theme. The common theme is Hesach Hadas. Right, a lack of awareness. Right, so in case number one, right, my friend was holding my garment, so kind of it was out of my domain. Hesach Hadas. That's what we're assuming. Case number two, I thought I was wearing my weekday suit. It turns out to be my Shabbos suit. Lapse of awareness. Case number three, right, Rachel and Leah mix up their clothing. Rachel thinks she's wearing her clothing. Leah thinks she's wearing her clothing. Hesach Hadas. Tuma. Okay, so Maskef Raboshe Alameata, by using this logic, Hoshit Yadola Salitol Paschitin Va'asla Pasorim, Hachanami Dinitmes. But so what about the following case? I put my hand into a basket to take a loaf of wheat bread. But it turns out that I take out a loaf of barley bread. Using this logic, what should be the halacha? The barley bread should be tameh. Because after all, again, what you're saying is a case of mistaken identity is effectively hesach hadas. So therefore, again, the loaf of bread should be tameh. Maybe they'll say, yeah, this is indeed the case. Well, it's not. Let's say someone's watching, guarding a barrel of wine, and they assume that the contents of the barrel are wine. I'm sorry. Somebody's guarding a barrel, right? And he thinks it's a barrel of wine. And it turns out it's not wine. What is it? It's oil. What's the halacha? TORAH milatame. Ultimately, again, it's starting. Rabbi said the lashon of TORAH milatame is that at the end of the day, it doesn't convey tumah to anything else, which for our purposes means, for right now, it's tahar. It's tahar. So Rabbi says, so that's a case of mistaken identity, right? I think I'm guarding a barrel of wine. It turns out to be a barrel of oil, and yet the halacha is that what? The halacha is that the contents of the barrel remain tahar. Remain tar. So halacha l'maisa, you see, mistaken identity doesn't result in hesach hadas. To which I should say, mistaken identity is not considered hesach hadas. So the Gemara is tamech. But according to this logic, look at the end of that very same brayso. Va'asura melachol. As much as the contents of the barrel are still considered to be tahar, I should say, tahora milatame, they don't convey tumah. What's the halacha? You're not permitted to consume the contents of the barrel. So I'll say this is very interesting. So on one hand, you're telling me, I'm guarding a barrel, I think it's wine, but it turns out to be oil. So the Brisa says the contents of the oil don't convey tumah to anything else, yet at the same time, what? I'm not allowed to eat them. I'm not allowed to eat the contents of the barrel. So what's going on over here? To which the Gemara says, Amai, why can't I eat the contents of the barrel? Rabbi Yirmiyah, here's the case. But Omer, this is fascinating. Shmartia midavra hamitama v'lo midavra haposla. Let's say this is absolutely fascinating. So remember, let's go back to Hilchos Tumah 101. Tumah, we've seen this many times before, essentially does not transfer laterally. But instead what happens is, when item A conveys Tumah to item B, what happens? It's always downgraded a level. So for example, let's just take a simple case, right? You have an Av HaTumah. Right, an avatuma. Right, a person touches a corpse, he becomes an av. That person then touches another person, becomes a rishon. Rishon makes a sheni, sheni makes a shlishi. Now I will say most times shlishi is the bottom, is the lowest level of tumah. Most times, right? Now I will say a shlishi cannot make a revi'i. So therefore a shlishi is called pasal. Pasal means it's unfit. It itself is tameh, but has an inability to convey tumah to anything else. By kodesh, we're going to say kodesh can actually make a revi'i. So the lashon of pasal is the lashon that the Gemara uses, saying that is tameh, but unable to convey tumah to anything else. So we'll say this is wild. So Yirmiyah says, what's the case? So we'll say, so let's just get our information together. So here's what we have. I'm guarding a barrel of wine. Right? Or at least I think it's a barrel of wine. It turns out that what? It's a barrel of oil. So what's the halacha? The halacha is that ultimately the contents of the barrel are tahar and can't convey tumah to anything else. But yet the same brisa says, I'm not allowed to consume the contents of the barrel. So what's going on over here? Why not? Why not? So on one hand, you're telling me that hesech hadas does not result in tumah. That's number one. But you see, yet I still can't eat the contents of the barrel. To which Rabbi Yirmiyah says, I'll tell you why. What's the case? Rabbi says, it's incredible. Where I say, Shmartia medavar hametame v'lo medavar hapostla. I guarded the contents of the barrel from becoming tameh with something that can make the end of the day, I guarded it from, let's say, coming in contact with an Av or a Rishon. But I didn't guard it from coming in contact with a Shlishi. In other words, I guarded it. I don't want the contents of the barrel to become tamei in a way that the contents could then convey tumah to something else. That's what I guarded it from. But I didn't guard it from just becoming pasul. Just becoming pasul. So that's what I'm saying. So but now it makes sense. So Lamaisa, again, my guarding is effective enough to ensure that it did not become tamei in a way that it could convey tumah to something else. That's what the Brisa said. But yet I can't consume the contents of the barrel because the contents themselves may be pasul. To which the Gemara says, what? Umi ika netirusa lapalga? Is there such a thing like that? Like a partial guarding for tumah? That I'm guarding for A and B, but not for C? So I'm going to make sure it doesn't come in contact with an Av or a Rishon, but I'm not so concerned it comes in contact with a Sheni. Is there such a concept like that? To which the Gemara says, there is. Vatanya, listen to this. I'll show you the proof to it. Hoshit yada b'sal, v'asal al ksef. Listen to this case. I put my hand into a sal as a basket, and ultimately the basket is on my shoulder. V'hamagrefa b'soch hasal, and there's a shovel inside of the basket. V'haya b'libo ala sal, v'alo haya b'libo ala magrefa. And it will say, in my heart, I'm careful. Ultimately, again, about, and I will say, by the way, there are also figs in the basket. That's the chap over here. Rashi points out, right? There are figs in the so a basket. Figs in the basket, shovel inside of the basket as well. So now what happens? And I have in mind to go ahead and watch the basket and the contents of the basket. Ultimately, again, but regarding the shovel, I'm not careful to guard the shovel. Hasal tar v'magrefa tmeya. Ultimately, again, the basket is tar because I had in mind to be vigilant and watch the basket. But interestingly enough, the shovel, which Rashi says is a metal utensil, is tameh. Why? Because at the end of the day, I was careful, I was makbid to watch the basket, but not careful to watch the shovel. The shovel sitting in the basket. So what do you see from here? That you could have kind of qualified das. I could have qualified intentionality to go ahead and guard something from tumah. So the Gemara says, but I don't understand. Hasaltar tetame hamagrefa l'sal. But I don't understand. If now you're telling me the shovel is tameh because I didn't have in mind to watch it, so shouldn't the shovel then go on to make the basket tameh? To which the Gemara says, no. In kli metame kli. We'll say hilchos tamantara. One utensil cannot make another utensil tameh through contact. Therefore, even though now the shovel is tameh, the shovel will not make the basket tameah. The tameh mashe besal, but shouldn't the shovel make the figs right inside of the basket tameh? Amravina kilot ba'omer shemartiv midavar shemetamo v'lo midavar haposla. What's the case? The case is where I say I watched the figs from becoming tameh with something that ultimately, again, could convey tumah to it, but not from something that could go ahead and make it possible. So I will say, so what do you see from here? You see from here that halacha lamaisa, the ability to go ahead and watch something partially does work. So I'll say, which is really fascinating, that I could go ahead and have in mind that I'm guarding something in a way that it shouldn't become tameh in one fashion, but yet I'm not guarding it from another fashion. In other words, I'm careful that it shouldn't become tameh from an av, from a rishon, but I'm not so makbid if it becomes tameh from a sheni. Okay, so miko makom kasha. Here's the problem. But ultimately, again, we still have a problem, what we said before, about the case of the barrel of the wine and the oil, because at the end of the day it said that it's tar milatame, to which the Gemara says, Moshe Rabba Baravua, listen to this case. Maisa bi'isha achos shabasa lifnei Rabbi Yishmael. We'll see another interesting case. There was once a situation of a woman. So we'll say, so just to be clear, there's a number of things that's happening over here. Right? So halacha l'maisa, we had three cases. We're kind of assuming that what's happening in the three cases is an issue of hesach hadas. So that's what we're assuming is driving a lot of this. We then brought up the case of the loaves of bread and the barrel of wine, which turned out to be a barrel of oil. And again, that was also brought up in the context of hesach hadas, but also in the context of the ability to guard against certain types of tumah, but yet not other types of tumah. And what we've seen is, it appears according to the Gemara, that you can guard produce in such a fashion. I'm guarding it against A, but not against B. Now watch this case. Rabbi Yishmael, Rabbi, beged ze araktiv betara, v'lo hayu belibi l'shomran betara. So listen to this. A woman once came before Rabbi Yishmael. She said, Rabbi, I wove a garment, and ultimately, again, I wove it in a total state of ritual purity, but I didn't have in mind. In other words, it wasn't my kavanah. In other words, which is another way of saying, behaviorally, everything I did was in a state of TORAH, but at the end of the day, I didn't have kavanah, right? I didn't have kavanah, I didn't have intent or concentration to do everything in a state of TORAH. Umitoch bediko shahir Rabbi Yishmael bodka, and as Rabbi Yishmael was kind of going ahead, look at Rashi just a moment. Araktiv betara yodas ani shemisha shenerag bo gimel al gimel etzbos shnir l'tuma lo naga batuma. So what this lady was saying was, I know that no tumah came in contact with this garment from the time that it was receptive to tumah. When does a beged become receptive to tumah? Once it's 3 finger breaths by 3 finger breaths. So this lady was saying, I know this garment did not become tameh, but I didn't have in mind to maintain its state of ritual purity. So says the Gemara, so listen to this. Umitoch b'digo she'haya Rabbi Yishmael baduka, because Rabbi Yishmael then was talking, let's talk, tell me everything that happened. So it turns out, as she was recounting the circumstances, Amrla Rebbe, nida mashche imi bechavel. You know what the truth is? There was a woman who was in nida who was helping me with some of the thread. That I will say, a woman who's in nida has the ability to convey tumah to a baguette. So I will say, what do you see from here? What you see from here, I will say, is that when you don't have explicit intent for something, you can't guarantee the quality or the nature of the circumstances. So here, this woman was convinced that she had created this baguette in a state of TORAH. But then as Rabbi Yishmael was just talking out the circumstances with her, she said, you know what, you're right. There was that woman who was the nida who helped me with some of the thread. And so it turned out that the baguette itself was Tameah. Rabbi was highlighting the yesod that what? If you don't have kavanah to maintain TORAH, then by definition, you can't assume that TORAH is there. Rabbi Yishmael said, Rabbi Yishmael, Kama gidol divrei chachamim she'omrim beliba l'shomro tar in beliba l'shomro tamei. How great are the words of the chachamim, where the chachamim say that if you have hesach hadas, if you do not concentrate, if you do not have specific intent to maintain the TORAH of an item, you cannot assume that it remains TORAH. Both say, what a profound yesod. You want TORAH in life? If I want TORAH, if I want purity, I want holiness in life. Holiness in life does not come with hesach hadas. If I fall asleep at the wheel and just live life on cruise control, you cannot assume that I've reached a level of TORAH, because there is tumah that attaches itself to us all of the time without us even realizing it. If you want TORAH out of life, TORAH requires vigilance. TORAH requires thought. TORAH requires concentration. And most importantly, TORAH requires constant awareness to my surroundings, to my influences, and to my circumstances. The moment that there is hesach hadas, I will say, what a metaphor for life. The moment that I have a lapse of awareness about how I'm living, what I'm doing, the decisions I'm making, is the moment that there's tumah. Right? When there's hesach hadas, I will say, you want TORAH in life, TORAH requires constant awareness. So the Gemara goes right to another story. There was another story of a woman who came for Rabbi Shmuel. Amar lo Rebbe. Same story. Woman comes along, she says, listen, I wove this particular mat in a state of Tara. But I didn't have intention to guard it. So I know that it's tar. I know that it's tar because nothing Tameh came in contact with it, but I never had specific intent to guard it against Tumah. We talk Rabbi Yishmael, both God, listen to this. And as Rabbi Yishmael was talking out, I will say, Rabbi Yishmael is just, it's interesting how so many times in life, when you just talk out circumstances, you become aware of things that you weren't even thinking about. So Rabbi Yishmael is just telling her, let's retrace your steps, right? So tell me about the process of going ahead and making this garment. Amr lo, she said, you know what, Rebbe, Neima nifsika ukishartia bepeh. At the end of the day, as I was weaving, what happened? One of the threads broke, and I went ahead and I tied it back together with my mouth. In other words, she's saying like I put the thread in my mouth to tie it back together. Now we'll say, what's the problem with that? Interestingly enough, remember, saliva is one of the liquids which makes an item receptive to tumah. So it turns out that there's the possibility that there was wet saliva on this garment that made this beged receptive to tumah. She didn't even think about this because this just happened in the process of sewing. Rabbi Shmuel, so what do you see from here? So therefore, again, because she wasn't concentrating and because the beged was potentially receptive to tumah, you can't assume that it's tahar. Once again, Rabbi Shmuel, kama gedolim divrei chacham omrim beliba l'shomer tahar. If you have in mind to watch something, to guard something, then you can attest to its level of ritual purity. Ein beliba l'shomro tameh. But I will say the moment that you're not paying attention, I will say it's so profound. It's true again. It's true for begadim and it's true for us in life. So I will say when you are guarding something from ritual purity, if you have active kavana to guard the item is tar. But if you have hesach hadas, if you have a lapse of awareness, you just stop guarding it. You ain't belibo, then ultimately you cannot assume the item is tar. And I will say again, if it's true for a beged, alachas kama v'kama, it is true for us in life. The most dangerous thing in life is hesach hadas. When you have a lapse of awareness, you stop concentrating on how I'm living, on what I'm doing, on how I'm acting. The moment I stop concentrating on how I live and what I do is the moment that Tara leaves the building and it is replaced with Tumah. Incredible. So listen to this. So now let's go back to the three cases. Rabbi Elazar Bat Tzadok, his was the case of the two women in the bathhouse. So remember again, they came before Rabbi Akiva, and what did Rabbi Akiva say? Everyone's clothing is tameh. Everyone's clothing is tameh. So the Gemara says that makes sense. Because we'll say it's possible that what? Most people are ameh haaretz. Right? So we'll say, what do I mean by that? Most people are not really knowledgeable, or for that matter, vigilant in the laws of Tumah and Tara. So therefore, again, in the case of the two women who mixed up their clothing, Rachel's going to say, Leah is a very nice lady, but she doesn't know the laws of Tumah and Tara. And Leah is going to say, Rachel's a very nice lady. She doesn't know the halachas of Tumah and Tara. So that's why, again, it makes sense. They swapped clothing unintentionally, and therefore, by definition, everyone's clothing is going to be tameh. Rabbi Yonasan ben Amram, Nami, listen to this, Kevan de Kelim de Shabbos Avidu Shimur Tfei. So remember again, Rabbi Yonasan ben Amram, his case was, I went in to get my weekday suit, but instead I took out my Shabbos suit. Right, so the Gemara says, right. So what happens? So Rabbi Yonasan ben Amram said, what's the case there? Listen to this. Kevan de Kelim de Shabbos Avlu Shimur Tfei. I will say. So here's what's interesting. I guess people are more careful with their Shabbos clothing than they are with their weekday clothing. So there's a heightened level of shmira for my Shabbos clothing than my weekday clothing. Therefore, masach daitem inayu. So everyone will say, it makes sense. I think I'm wearing my weekday suit, and therefore, again, that's a lower level of shmira. It turns out that I'm actually wearing my Shabbos suit, which normally gets a higher level of shmira. Therefore, the Shabbos suit is considered to be tameh. El Rabbi Yonasan ben Elazar, navelu shir biyadei dechav. Remember again. Let's go back to the first case. Rabbi Yonasan ben Elazar. What was that case? I lost my cloak. I say, Reuven, can you do me a favor? Can you pick up my cloak for me? Right? So what did Rabbi Yonasan ben Elazar say? Cloak is tameh. Why? Why can't I just go ahead? Here, I see Reuven. He's right in front of me. So the Gemara says, Navid le shimur biyadei dechavre. Why can't I go ahead and just guard the garment as while it's in Reuven's hand? Rabbi Yochanan will say, profound Gemara, Chazaka, ein adam mishamer ma shebiyad chavero. He'll say, what's the chazaka? You cannot guard that which is in someone else's hand. We'll say, look at Rashi. Actually, not yet, sorry. You can't guard that, which again is a general call in halacha. A general call in halacha. You can't guard that which is in someone else. Once someone else has it, we'll say, now again, to be clear, what's the case here? Where's Reuven? He's right in front of me. He's literally right in front of me. But the Gemara says you cannot exert your shimur, right? My shimur means I have to guard an item to maintain its level of tara. When something is in someone else's hand, I can't guard the level of tara. So the Gemara says, Velo, is that true? Amud Beis, Vatanya, we learned, Harish Shahayu Chamaravu Pollack to in Toros. So we'll say, listen to this interesting case. It's fascinating. I have, Baruch Hashem, a business. I'm transporting items. And what happens? I have donkey drivers and I have workers and they are transporting Tohoros. So we'll say, now again, Rashi points out, Chamar v'polav amia aretz. So my workers and my donkey drivers, they're amaratzim, right? They don't know the laws of Tumantara. Now here's an interesting case. But yet I need them, but yet I'm in the business of Taros transport. That's my thing, right? So I transport Taros. So I need my workers now to transport my Taros from point A to point B. So how do I do this? So the Gemara says, even though I will say now, obviously, if I'm going ahead and I'm traveling with my workers, great. I'm traveling with my workers, I keep an eye on them. The Brisa says, even if I'm not traveling with my workers, even if I am a mil, just a significant distance away, even if I'm a mil away from them, taros of Tohoros. The taros are still tar. Now, I will say, now, that's pretty incredible, because what does that say? That Allah, even though I'm not there with them, we still assume that the taros are tar. That seems to contradict what we just said before. We just said before, anything you have that's in someone else's hand, you cannot assume retains its taros status. Yet here, the items are able to retain their taros status, even though what? I'm a mil away. There's another case. However, vim amar lahem, but if I said to my workers, and then what? So, by the way, when it says taros of tohoros, look at Rashi. Vein choshishin shema nagu. So, I will say, interestingly enough, we're not choshesh that while on the road, my workers put their hands into the barrel and touch the taros. So, I will say, however, but if I said to my workers, you guys go ahead and I'll catch up with you. Taros of Timeos. Once they are out of ocular view, right? Once I can no longer see them, then Allah we have to assume that what? They put their hands in the barrel and the taros are tameh. So the Gemara says, I don't understand. Maishna reishna, maishna seifa. I don't understand. I will say the cases seem to be the same, yet the results are different. Case number one, my workers who are amei aretz and therefore don't know lachas of tum and tara, they're transporting my taros, and yet the halacha is what? The taros are assumed to be tar, even if I'm more than a mil away. Case number two, I tell them, guys, you go ahead and I'll catch up with you. Once they're out of sight, we have to assume all the taros became tameh. What's there seen in two cases? Here we go. Reisha. The first case in the Brisa is where I am mitaher my workers. Hey, you want to work for me? You have to go to the mikvah, para aduma, whatever you have to do in order to go ahead and become tar. So I've made them all tar. Well, if that's the case, ihachi seifanami. If that's the case, then I don't understand. Then the seifa should also be okay. Right, then even if I'm mitaher them, then halacha l'maisa, even the seifa case shouldn't be a problem. To which the Gemara says, Ein ama'aretz makbirach magechavero. While the ama'aretz might be tar, the ama'aretz is not careful with his friend touching the produce. Well, if that's the case, ihachi reisha nami. Right? If that's the case, in the first case, even if I'm mitar the ama'aretz, it should still be a problem. To which the Gemara says, here's the case. Beba lahem derech alakson. I will say, what's the case? The case is where halacha l'maisa, I can go ahead and catch up with my workers without them knowing it. Derech alakson literally means at a alakson literally means like at a diagonal. But Rashi says over here, kishiyachol lavo lahem pitom derech alakson shelo yavinu hilchach dechali minas. So let's listen to this. The case over here is where I could catch up with my workers at any given moment and they'll be totally unaware. I will say this is, what hashgacha is based on, right? If you don't have a mashgiach at all times, how can you assume the food is kosher? As long as the mashgiach can be what's called yotzei v'nichnas, he could come in and go out at any time. We assume that everyone is on their best behavior when they know that their boss could walk in at any time. So what's the case? The case is where halacha l'maisa, the workers know I could pop in at any time, right? I could just show up by the caravan at any time. So because of that, the knowledge that I could show up at any time keeps them honest. Ihachi seifa nami. What about the sefer? That's the case of sefer as well. Kevan damar lehu luchu va'ani avo acharechem mismach samcha datayu. Now, here's the difference. See, once you tell your workers, guys, you go ahead and I'll catch up at some later time. That's it. The workers know I'm not showing up anytime soon, and therefore halacha l'maisa again, right? When the cat is away, the mice will play, and they're going to go ahead and put their hands inside of the barrel. But I will say, here's what's interesting. So what's interesting to note about this is as follows. That halacha l'maisa, so this case of the traveling caravan has its own unique aspects to it, right? Essentially, that the owner could show up at any time. So if I have a case where I purified my workers, that's the case, right? I was metayer all of my workers. They're now in a state of tara. They're transporting the taras, and they know that what? I can go ahead and show up at any time. So you put all of that together, and we can assume that the ritual purity of the items remains intact. But I will say, outside of that, the principle espoused by the Gemara is the halacha l'maisa principle, which is ein adam mishamer mash biyad chavero. You cannot guard that which is in your friend's hand. Once the item is in someone else's hand, so the ritual purity of the item is by definition compromised, because I can't have shmira upon something that you're holding, even if what? You're mamish right next to me. That's why the case where I drop my cloak, I ask Reuven to pick it up. The Grace has said, Rabbi Yonasan ben Elazar says that the cloak will be tameh because ein adam mishamer masha biyad chavero. I cannot properly guard for ritual purity purposes that which is in someone else's hand. Shabbos say also an incredible life lesson, which is you can't control other people. Right? You can't guard that which is in someone else's hands. Right? At the end of the day, the only thing I control, both say, it's such a profound yesod, the only thing I control in life is what? That which is in my hand. Anything that is in someone else's hand, even if the person is mamish standing right next to me, you can't control what other people do, how other people live, what other people say. The only thing in life you control is you and that which is in your hand. Hadron Allah ein darshan. Rabosai mazel tov. Chomer bekodesh mitzruma. You got nervous that Tumantara is over. Well, good news, it's not. Right? There's more to come. There's more to come. Rabosai after mid. Incredible Gemaras. Rabosai, so now listen to this. Chomer bekodesh mitzruma. There's a chumrah that Kodesh has over Truma. Remember again, Kodesh refers to sacrificial items. So there's a chumrah that Kodesh has over Truma. How so? This is fascinating. Shemat bilim kelim b'soch kelim l'Truma, avalo l'Kodesh. This is fascinating. For Truma purposes, if you have, let's say, 2 cups, imagine 2 cups for a moment, that are both tameh, you could put one inside of the other and immerse them in the mikvah like that. But you can't do that for Kodesh. So such an immersion will work to purify for Truma, but won't work for Kodesh. That's Chomer number 1. Chomer number 2. Acharayim v'toch ubeis hatzvita b'truma avalo b'Kodesh. Shabbos say we're going to see something very interesting. That halacha l'maisa, when it comes to Truma, if you have a utensil that has multiple usable parts, when one usable part becomes tameh, it doesn't automatically mean that the entire kli becomes tameh. Yet when it comes to Kodesh, right, once one part of the utensil becomes tameh, then what? The entire utensil becomes tameh. Hanose as hamedris, nose as hatruma, avalo as hakodesh. Someone who is holding, I will say, for example, something that has tumas medrish. For example, Rashi's example is the shoe of a zav. If I hold the shoe of a zav, I can also go ahead and hold truma, right, as long as they don't touch, right? Now we're going to see, I'll say, what it really means is, if, let's say, imagine for a moment, you have the shoe of a zav inside of a barrel, you could go ahead and have truma inside the airspace of that same barrel. but you can't have kodesh inside of the airspace of that barrel. Big day, we'll explain all of these cases. Big day, ochle truma medras lakodesh. We'll stop over here for today. We'll pick up Emirat Hashem in the middle of this Mishnah tomorrow. We'll say Mazel Tov on finishing the parak, and Emirat Hashem will go through all of these categories in tomorrow's daf as well. Shkoyach.